Hi guys, this is going to be your reading video for the week of October the 5th. In the past lessons, we've learned a little bit about the main idea and we talked about the author's purpose. Remember that the main idea is the most important thing that the story is about. A lot of times we can look at the pictures and the title to predict what the main idea is going to be. As we read, we can find the main idea at the beginning of the story, and it usually is followed up by details that support the main idea. We also learned a little bit about author's purpose. And so when we think about a story, we want to consider the purpose that the author has for writing a story. If you remember when we studied about author's purpose, there were three, and we used the little acronym PIE, P-I-E. P stands for to persuade, I is inform, and the E represents entertain. There are three main reasons an author will write a story: to persuade the reader, to inform the reader, or to entertain the reader. And so we talked a little bit about those three things and why an author might write a story. And remember that persuade means to get you to think a certain way or to believe a certain thing. To inform is giving you information or facts about a topic. And to entertain would just be a fun story to read. As we look at this week's story, we're going to be looking at a fable. If you remember, a couple of weeks ago, we did the story, The Foolish Milkmaid. In The Foolish Milkmaid, that story was a fable. Remember that a fable teaches us a lesson. And so the author's purpose for writing a fable is to teach you something. Most of the time, a fable will have animal characters, and it will have a lesson or a moral at the end. As we look in our reading booklets, we're going to be on page 6 and 7, and we're going to be reading about the Daydreaming Sprinter. And when I look at the pictures on this page, I see some people lined up, and they look like they're about to run a race. When I think about the title of the story, I'm not really sure what a sprinter is. But by looking at this picture, I see this boy, and he's kneeling down, getting ready to run. And there is a caption above his head, a bubble. And he is thinking about, what are you thinking? Trophies. A ribbon and trophies. So I bet he's thinking about winning. And when I think about the title, The Daydreaming Sprinter, I can go ahead and predict that the daydreamer is the boy because he's dreaming about these trophies. And I can predict that a sprinter is someone who runs in a race. So I'm guessing the boy is the daydreaming sprinter. As I read, I'm going to learn a little bit more about the daydreaming sprinter. And I want you to listen as I read this story to hear if you can find a lesson to be learned in this story. I also want us to be thinking about making connections. When I read a story, I can make connection with what I read. Today, we're going to be making connections with this story. You can make connections to a text that you read, or to your own experiences, or different things you've learned about the world. Making connections with a text can help you to relate to the characters and the events, and it can help you better understand the story. I'll make a connection first. Then you can make two connections on your own. Okay, are you ready? So I'm going to read aloud the first part of the story, and then I'll make a connection. and then you can make one as we go, all right? The Daydreaming Sprinter by Charles R. Smith, Jr. The 50-yard dash was Gerald's best race. He was the fastest kid in his class, his grade, and his school. Today, the winner of the city championships would go on to the state championship. Why is everybody taking so long? Gerald wondered as the other runners slowly wedged their feet into the starting blocks. Only 50 yards between me and another trophy, Gerald said. If I get a good start, I'll surely win. Then his thoughts turned to the state championship. Look at him thinking about those trophies. So he's thinking before the race starts. As we're reading, I think I'm already predicting what's going to happen. Are you? Gerald seems a little bit boastful, doesn't he? What does it mean to be boastful or prideful? That's right. When you think too much of yourself, or maybe you're thinking too highly of yourself. As I think about what's happened, Gerald has a lot to be proud of. He's the fastest kid. But all he can think about is getting another trophy. So sometimes there are a little bit more important things to think about, aren't there? We're going to see what happens to Gerald in just a minute. But before we do, I want to make a connection. As I'm reading this story, I'm thinking about a time when I had to run a race. I'm making a connection with Gerald. When I was in high school, I was on the cross-country track team, and we had to run lots of races, and there were lots of people there. And so as I'm thinking about this story with Gerald, I'm thinking about lining up on the track just like Gerald did. And I'm thinking about what it felt like and how nervous I was waiting for it to start and thinking about who was going to win, who was going to finish first. I'm making a connection to Gerald because it's something that I have done in the past. I can also make a connection to running a race if I've read a book. As I'm thinking about a fable, I'm thinking about another story that I have read that reminds me of Gerald. And it's The Hare and the Tortoise. Have you ever heard of that story? Right, it's a fable. And so we're going to look at that story later this week. But a fable, remember, teaches you a lesson. In the story, The Hare and the tortoise is racing against the hare, who is a rabbit. The rabbit gets really boastful, doesn't he? He's very prideful of how fast he is. And he begins to take a nap. But the tortoise ends up winning, doesn't he? That's right. So the tortoise and the hare reminds me a little bit of this story. They're getting ready to run the race, and all Gerald can think about is winning. So I can make a text-to-text connection. I'm making a connection with this story to another story. All right, let's keep reading and see if we can make any more connections. If I win at states, he said under his breath, the newspapers will take pictures of me. Everybody will want to meet me. I'll probably even get on TV. I really have to get out of the blocks first. The starter called out, On your mark. Gerald's mind was busy, still wondering, where will I put that state trophy? It will probably be bigger than the others, maybe as big as me. Then the starter announced, Get set. Gerald sprang up out of the blocks, but instead of hearing cheers, he heard whistles. An official ran up and grabbed Gerald to keep him from running any farther. Let's turn the page. I'm sorry, son, but you jumped the gun. That's an automatic disqualification. A puzzled look came over Gerald's face. Disqualification? He asked. A false start. You left the blocks before the word go. In this race, false starts are not allowed. I'm afraid you won't be competing at the States. Gerald didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. All he could do was shake his head at what could have been. Oh, poor Gerald. What does it mean, a disqualification? That means he doesn't get to participate at all. What happened to Gerald? He was too busy thinking about winning, wasn't he? Look, he's daydreaming instead of paying attention. And because he wasn't paying attention, he started too soon and he got kicked out of the race. Now Gerald doesn't even get a chance to win that trophy. Well, that's pretty sad, isn't it? That reminds me of the story, The Hare and the Tortoise. You know, the hare was so sure he would win, wasn't he? And in the end, the tortoise ended up winning. He was pretty embarrassed. I bet Gerald was pretty embarrassed too. Did you make any connections as we read the rest of the story? Have you ever been in a competition and been disqualified? Have you ever heard of something happening to someone else like that? Or maybe have you read a book about something happening to someone where they were in a race or in a competition and they ended up not winning? You know, it can be sad, can't it? If you've ever been in anything and then didn't win. As we've talked about this story, we've made several connections. We've made a connection to ourselves, something that we've experienced, like the character in the story. We've made a connection with another story, The Hare and the Tortoise. So we can make a text-to-text connection of something that we've already read and compare these characters in this story to those characters in that story. We can also make a world connection, something that we've heard about or seen about somewhere else, or to someone else, or with someone else in the world. And so as we read, making connections can help us better understand the story and can help us better predict what's going to happen in the end. You know, when I was thinking about Gerald at the beginning, daydreaming, I knew that didn't sound like it was a good idea. Because if you're in a race, you really need to be paying attention, don't you? So I was already predicting that something bad is probably going to happen to Gerald. I used the pictures and I used the title to help me predict what I thought might happen to Gerald in the end. What kind of a lesson do you think that we should learn from this story? I think it helps us to remember that we always need to pay attention and we always need to be focused on the task at hand, don't we? Don't get too concerned about something before it really happens. Have you ever heard the saying, don't count your chickens before they hatch? Sometimes older people say that. And that's just a funny way of saying, don't worry about what's going to happen in the future so much that you don't focus on what's happening right now. Gerald was counting his trophies before he actually had one, right? He should have been worried more about the race before he was worried about the trophy. He was worrying about the end instead of worrying about where he was doing right now. You know, an author can teach us a lesson in a story, and it can help us to learn what to do in our own life. And so this story is an example of teaching us a lesson. In this week's stories, we're going to be reading about several more characters, and we're going to learn what lessons that they have to teach us. And as we read those, we're going to be making connections with the text and with the characters to help us learn more about those stories. I'll see you next time. Bye.